Hi everyone, I'm Kyle Bechet, and this is the AAF Exchange, a podcast from the American Action Forum, where experts provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic policy issues. Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. On this episode of the AAF Exchange, a review of the Biden administration's changes to the regulatory process, as well as the latest on inflation and the debt limit debate. Joining us to discuss all this is AAF President Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Doug, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, another fun week here in D.C. How's everything been?
My life is a charmed existence, as you know, so no problem.
We've started hitting that 80-degree, almost 90-degree weather, and I know both of us, being Northeasterners, we're not ready for this kind of warmth yet.
Ever.
At least there's no humidity yet, right? So, something to be happy about, I guess. Before we jump into everything, as always, it is time for your reaction. Tell us what's on your mind.
I've changed that since I did the Maria Bartiromo show this morning, and I'm just irked about the whole debt limit discussion. The debate, or the way it gets discussed in the media, is sort of the moral high ground argument. Republicans are right, Joe Biden's right, no one ever talked about the Senate, but the point is we need the debt limit to go up, and to do that we need the House, the Senate, and the White House to all approve something. And since politics is supposed to be the art of getting to yes, they need to start doing their job and get to yes. And so all of them are equally culpable in this situation. It makes me crazy.
Yeah, I mean, what you hear in the rhetoric is basically the moral high ground argument a lot of times. And we'll get into the debt limit a little bit, after later on in the podcast. But yeah, it just seems like the back and forth has gone on for longer than usual.
Well, we've gone 2 months and made no progress whatsoever.
Yeah.
That's not great in my view.
Yeah. All right. Well, something to
We'll come back to that.
We'll come back to that. We'll put a pin in it for now. But let's start with the economic news that we learned this week. We saw both. Yesterday we had the CPI report. Today we had the PPI report. Tomorrow we'll get some other economic reports. What do we learn about the state of inflation?
I don't think we learned as much as many people think. The instant reaction to yesterday's CPI report was that it was a great report. Inflation was down. In retrospect, when I sort of stared at it over the course of the past 24 hours, we saw energy prices fall at an annual rate of 10%, over 10%. That's really it. Outside of that, we got more of the same kind of bad news. Food prices up 8.4% year over year, shelter 8.2% year over year, still haven't peaked on the shelter front. Core inflation unchanged. And so if you think about the inflation problem, it's services and shelter's the poster child for that. And that's not really making any progress. You get the PPI report today, and it comes in soft. Again, top line down 0.5%. That's just energy prices again. You look at the core and the PPI, and it comes down some. And so that the reflex is, yes, good news. The PPI is all about goods. And that's not a problem. Our problem is services. And so I don't think either of these reports amount to something that says we changed direction. If the Fed was going to raise before, it's going to raise still. And I think there's a good chance they're not done at the end of the May meeting. They'll go up a quarter point and then keep watching.
Yeah, when you're doing your weekly CPI video yesterday, that was the one takeaway I said, is that, before we started filming, you zeroed in on that shelter and said, that's really strange.
Yeah.
And it seems like now that you've had more time to look at it, it's like, ooh, this is
still an issue.
Good.
That's all there is to it.
Is this because, it takes longer to see the changes in the shelter?
Shelter's a particularly unusual category because think of apartment leases. You sign once a year. Yeah. So the actual price that people are paying reflects something that went on up to 11 months ago. As those leases turn over, we're going to see shelter come down. I'm sure of it. The market's gotten softer. But until we actually see everything in the non-shelter services go down, you can't really be confident you've got the disinflation. And we just really haven't seen that. That's been pretty sticky.
Yeah, I mean, looking in the realm of looking ahead, I mean, the New York Fed on Monday, you shared with me that link, also updated their expectations for inflation, and 1 year from now, they changed their expectations to actually going up, inflation actually going back up slightly, and then projecting it won't fall below the 2% target in 5 years, I think it was. Right. What does this say about the Fed's efforts to bring down inflation?
So the two pieces that Powell emphasized when he launched this effort was, number one, inflation expectations. Let's get them under control. And they had been making progress on that, but they seem to have stalled somewhere between 4 and 5%. And don't ease prematurely. Inflation seems to have stalled somewhere between 4 and 5%. So my view of the universe is we're sort of cruising along at between 4 and 5% inflation, depending on which measure you go with. People are expecting that. That's a lot of work left to do then. And people are acting as if the Fed is done. You can't make that all add up. That's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much to read into this. I mean, you're the economist in the room, but it really does seem a little makes me a little nervous that their 5-year mark still has them above 2%. Yeah. I mean, it's only a couple of decimal points above 2%, but it's still above 2%.
The Fed staff. This is the other big news of the week. They put out the minutes for the March meeting, and the staff always gives the staff forecast. The minutes revealed that the staff forecast said there would be a recession late this year and that inflation would come down sharply in 2024. Despite that, the Federal Open Market Committee raised rates. So if you've got 300 economists, the best thing to do is ignore them. Right? I mean, that's the message there. But I think it tells you how this Fed's operating. Like they want to see actual inflation come down before they declare victory. In the past, they would have declared victory in that. That would have been, okay, we're on the right track. It will happen. We're going to stop. That's what Volcker did, and that's what Powell said they will not do. So they're going to keep pushing.
Interesting. Yeah. Speaking of what the Fed might do, their next meeting's in May. What do you think the takeaway from these reports and what we learned this week is? Do you expect them to stay the course with these 25 basis points, or will they stop, put the brakes on, or will they go back up again?
They're going to go 25 basis points. I don't see anything in the reports that's so alarming they'd go to 50. They're set up to, have a bias toward doing too much. So if you're going to do too much, don't do it too quick. And so they're going to stay at 25. I think what these reports really do is they take off the table the idea that they're done. They have to consider the possibility of more rate hikes past May. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you said earlier this week that they don't want to seem like they're panicking with the increase.
Yeah, that 50 basis points would look like panic.
Yeah, at this point.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll find out in May what they actually decide to do. Let's turn to the administration and regulations. The Biden administration last week announced a host of reforms to the regulatory process. What do we know about these changes?
So this dates back to literally the day that President Biden was inaugurated. He put out an executive order that directed the Office of Management Budget to, quote, modernize the regulatory process and include language about incorporating unquantifiable benefits. Now, as a conspiracy theorist of first order, I put on my tinfoil hat and thought, what are they up to? I mean, it turns out I expected them to somehow really just put their thumb on the cost-benefit process, put in unquantifiable benefits, and get the regulations they wanted to pass. They didn't quite do that. It's more subtle than that. If you put on 2 tinfoil hats, you can get to the conspiracy. Number one, they changed the threshold for what's called an economically significant rule from $100 million to $200 million of costs imposed on the private sector. They advertise this as just adjusting for inflation. The 100 million benchmark from the 90s to today's environment really should be 200. That's probably all there is to it. But it does take a lot of regulations that previously would have been reviewed out of the review. So much of what they're up to will be not scrutinized as closely as otherwise. Second thing they did was they changed the discount rates. Discount rates are essentially the interest rates that are written into the memo. The lower is the discount rate, the more important are future benefits. So if you do something that's costly now, but the benefits are 10 years from now, if the interest rate's 100%, it's essentially worthless to you. If it's 0, it's the same as being right now. So this is a way to have more benefits count in the benefit cost calculation, because most regs have their costs in the present. You do something, and then the benefits accrue later. So that's going to slide some things over the line. Then the third thing they did, which was seemingly the weirdest, is they made big changes in the way they convene meetings. They said, we want this process, which is run by OMB in the Office of Regulatory Affairs. Your stakeholders are allowed to weigh in and tell them what they think of a proposed regulation, proposed rulemaking, and they want underserved communities to be better represented in this process, which seems very arcane and weird. And they are going to do outreach and put things on the website so they can go get it. And I can only assume this is to make sure that there's more lobbying for and against particular regs by groups they care about. And so who knows how this plays out, but it was a very strange thing to be a centerpiece.
Is that different than how they do public interest comments now? Is it
just you OMB need to make more efforts to make sure people weigh in.
Okay.
People who might not traditionally weigh in. We know ExxonMobil is going to show up.
Right.
We know that Greenpeace is going to show up.
Right.
But the folks who live next to the power plant, are they going to show up? Let's find out.
Interesting. What's the likely impact of these regulatory changes? I mean, what will this mean? More regulate? I mean, what does this mean for what the administration is trying to accomplish for regulations that they could not do under the old system?
In the most benign interpretation, it doesn't change things much at all. They get more comments on it. Maybe that changes the outcome. Doesn't change the math. But the discount rate matters, and they're going to get more benefits, the same costs, and more likely to pass the regulations. So I think it's a sort of a pro-regulatory move.
All right. Well, it's now time for your favorite part of the podcast. We're going to take a break from our discussion today. And
I think convening the groups counts as trivia, and I've already answered that.
Yeah, well, so we're going to do the fact of the day trivia today.
Oh, okay.
And I think this is where I ask Alyssa for a drum roll, and sometimes she puts one in to make me not look insane, but we'll see how that goes. All right. And I should also mention that this is actually one of the questions that we're going to put to the people that we're going to do the trivia tomorrow to.
Then we can't put the answer on the podcast.
Well, we can. So if they listen, we'll know who listens to the podcast and who doesn't listen to the podcast. This is my way to root them out. How many years has the federal government run an on-budget surplus since 1969?
3.
Okay. What do you know what they are for extra credit?
That'd be 98, 99, 2000.
Oh, you confused 98. Was in there. That was the unified budget surplus.
Damn, I knew it was one of those.
Yeah, so it was actually only 2. It was 99 and 2000.
Okay.
But I wanted to see if you threw one of the unified ones in there just to see. But I'll give you.
It's been a long time since we did unified or on budget. What's the difference between unified?
I was going to ask you that question.
It's essentially Social Security. Social Security is quote off budget.
Okay.
And so. In those halcyon days, Social Security was running surpluses, and so it would change the unified because you had a little extra to add in.
Yeah, and as we've discussed in previous podcasts, that's not the case anymore.
No longer the case. Yes, red ink everywhere.
Yeah. So speaking of the budget and debts, let's check in on Congress to end today.
Okay.
As you've already mentioned, the debt ceiling is before them, and while they're not in session, there is back and forth going on over this issue. I mean, it was discussed. It's being discussed in the news. It's being talked about in public forums at home. What's the latest on these negotiations? Where are we?
Truthful answer is we don't know.
Yeah.
One hopes that they're back channeling and going back and forth all the time, trying to get to yes. The things that have been floated publicly that would be important to Republicans to get on a debt ceiling bill are probably the only real news. And they are things like H.R. 1, which was their permitting and energy development bill. Put that on. That'll produce some growth, help the budget. Getting rid of unobligated balances from COVID and stimulus bills, sort of pull that off, sort of take care of that. Work requirements and social welfare programs, that's a thing that's floated. So some relatively small ball, to be honest, proposals that would accompany a debt ceiling increase. And now they're starting to talk about doing it for a short term so that they can negotiate more on real spending cuts. I don't understand the logic of that. If you can't get to the real spending cuts the first time, what's going to happen the second time? But this is a very standard congressional maneuver. Wouldn't be shocked if it happened.
Yeah, I mean, the timeline on this seems, it's jumbled. I've heard some say they want to get this done by the end of April. Treasury says June. Other people have said
August
sometime in
18th, August 18th from Moody's.
Yeah,
very precise.
Right. So I mean, what is the timeline on this?
We don't know.
Yeah, it's whenever they.
So remember, the magic here is the quote extraordinary measures. We are up against the debt limit. So to get relief, you take some debt out of the government pension funds for the employees, and now that counts against the limit. So you take that back, and now we're under the limit temporarily. We can issue some debt to the public, get some cash, pay some bills. So getting cash is everything in this game. How long can you have enough cash? Depends on how much comes in on April 15th, tax day, how much comes in on June 15th, which is a quarterly payment. So most businesses will be sending in their payroll and income tax withholding. If those are real strong, we go longer. If those turn out to be weak, then deadline's probably June.
Yeah. You made an interesting observation either early this week or last week about the extraordinary measures where it's not really solving any of the problems that
So there are lots of things that are getting bandied about here as, quote, solutions. And we're doing the extraordinary measures. They will run out. So that's not a permanent solution. The next thing in line is this notion of prioritization. We're going to create piles. First pile is going to be interest and principal and treasuries. We'll pay that. Then we'll do another pile, which is Social Security and Medicare, and we'll pay that. And pile 3, too bad. Like if you're a defense contractor, we're not going to pay you, even though you're delivering a product and we've signed a contract. And prioritization is just extraordinary measures in disguise, because right now we're stiffing the government employees. We're stealing their pension funds. In prioritization, we'd be stiffing the defense contractors. I will note for the record, they have weapons, so that doesn't last forever.
Yeah.
That doesn't solve the problem.
I mean, we have a couple of hot button issues going on in the world. Might not be the best time to be stiffing defense.
So I think it's not tenable to suggest that prioritization will give you a way to avoid raising the debt limit. You've got to do it.
Yeah. Speaking of spending and budgets and all this, we are technically in the budget season. So one would think,
how would you know?
So one would think we would be hearing more on the budget and getting some news about what the appropriations are going to look like coming out of Congress or the administration. I mean, is there any forecasts here? What should we be looking for?
It's easy to forecast the Senate because it's not going to do anything. The Senate Budget Committee has no interest in doing budget work. It's held 8 hearings on climate change and nothing on the budget. So they won't do a budget resolution. The House has claimed it will do a budget resolution, and indeed one of the promises made during McCarthy's election was that they would put out a budget that came to balance in 10 years. That's arithmetically implausible. That's a gracious word. So I don't know when they're going to deliver on that, but they've promised to do a budget resolution. The president's budget has been sent up and disappeared without a trace. That becomes standard. So this is sort of a sad state of budgetary affairs. There's no using the budget as a genuine planning document, which is what a budget should be. And when it goes over to OMB, if they've done the planning seriously, then OMB knows how to enforce it. Otherwise, they're just on their own, and they'll do what they want, and then Congress will complain about it. But they didn't deliver any instructions, so that's where we are.
Interesting. Well, I guess we'll have to wait and find out about all of this with Congress.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned. So, Doug, thanks for joining us and for another podcast.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Tune back in for our next episode, where our experts will provide clear, data-driven insights into today's economic and domestic issues. I'd also encourage you to check out any of the links in our show notes and also follow us on social media to learn more about AAF. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play.